Hello, everyone. Welcome to our first keynote for our thematic session, Automata, Cyber Terror, and Technocratic Realities from our 50 Plus Shades of Gothic conference. I'm very glad and thankful to be able to welcome Xavier Aldana Reyes. Well, to begin with, we'll briefly introduce him. Dr. Xavier Aldana Reyes is a Reader Associate Professor in English Literature and Film at Manchester Metropolitan University and a founder member of the Manchester Centre for Gothic Studies. He is the author of the books Gothic Cinema from 2020, Spanish Gothic from 2017, Horror Film and Effect from 2016, and Valley Gothic from 2014, and the editor of 21st Century Gothic and Edinburgh Companion, with Maisha Webster from 2019, Horror and Literary History from 2016, and Digital Horror with Lian Blake from 2015. Xavier is chief editor of the Horror Studies book series at University of Wales Press and has edited anthologies of Gothic and horror fiction for the British Library. More recently, he has started collaborating with Arrow Video, Diabolic DVD, and Cauldron Films on special editions of cult film classics. One of Xavier's research interests is the optical dynamics of found footage horror films. On this topic, he has published an article on narrative framing for Gothic studies and chapters on affective immersion in the film Wreck and viewer involvement and guilt in The Last Horror Movie for different edited collections. More recently, he has written a chapter on online Gothic that considers social media found footage horror and which will appear in the forthcoming collection, The Edinburgh Companion to Global Gothic. And if you happen to be interested in some of the ideas that we are going to explore in his interview today, you can also attend the Digital International Gothic Conference this March, when he will be presenting the paper Desktop Horror and the Crisis of the Digital Image. So to begin with, as I'm sure that Xavier and all of our audience are aware, along with our increased dependency on technology, there has been a surge in fiction that has focused on cyberculture and the digital and the dangers of technology, so to speak. So I would like to set off our conversation by thinking about the position of the audience when consuming this type of content. So in the last years, we can find various instances in both video games and movies of productions that are or appear to be recorded screens, both from computer and phones, which is known as the desktop horror that you've been exploring in your research. So my question is, how is this voyeuristic perspective important for the Gothic and the horror genre?
First of all, thank you for that lovely introduction. I'm delighted to be here. To answer your question, so I would say that desktop horror is part of a larger, what we could call computer screen cinema, which, not all of it is necessarily horrific, but desktop horror in particular focuses on the dark side of those connected anxieties that you were mentioning. I think it primarily is interested in something that you've raised, the issue of dependency on the digital world that we currently have for practically everything. It's inconceivable. Even the thought of giving up on, social media or even smartphones is unthinkable, since we need them for virtually everything. So I think part of the interest is how those platforms and how those gadgets are currently filtering life for us. We're living lives through our screens, through our gadgets, and with that in mind, the kind of fears that lie extant there. So not just fraud, for example, how open to fraud we are the moment our bank details are on our phones and so on, but also the issue of surveillance, which I think is key to the 21st century and to the development of found footage. Shoshana Zuboff has written brilliant work on this topic and what she calls surveillance capitalism. But the fact that literally everything we do online leaves a blueprint, and not just a blueprint, but what's called behavioral surplus, which is being sort of used and sold really for by companies like Facebook, like Google, for the benefit of others. And normally that ends up transforming into us being sold things we don't necessarily want. So that's one aspect. I think a lot of that voyeuristic part of it comes from the awareness that with social media comes the forfeiting necessarily of some personal freedoms. And another side of that, I think, has to do inevitably with the nature of social media. And I think a lot of films like Megan is Missing, or The Den, or the Unfriended films, or even Rata, which I watched more recently, all sort of like explore different ideas of, your platforms and media being dispossessed, taken over by someone else, or the fact that you're being recorded almost constantly by one gadget or another, and so the potential for that to be hacked, if not by a person, then by a corporation. I think all of that comes through in desktop horror. And I think that obviously, as with all horror that explores the idea of voyeurism, there's a sense of involvement in this, that the viewer is part of the engagement. And I think, this is true of found footage horror that's not in the desktop tradition. I'm thinking of films like The Last Horror Movie, for example. But in the desktop horror tradition, things like Open Windows, for example, or a film like Untraceable, which experienced or was interested in people signing on to watch other people being tortured, which is an idea that's been also exploited by another film more recently called Keep Watching, where people log in to watch other people being tortured. So I think that part of it has to do with what's our position there. Are we willing or passive onlookers to this violence? And I can't help but think that this is related to social media and how we consume other people's lives, and how that forces us to mediate our own. But I suspect these are topics we might pick up as the conversation develops.
So with these ideas in mind, as a response to our increased dependency on technology, which I guess it's a form of reflection of contemporary cultural anxieties. We see that part of this anxiety corresponds to our experience of space and time, and what you were saying about our own involvement. So in your work on horror film and affect, you analyze found footage as a way of positioning the audience as witness. Now comparing this found footage with desktop horror, and I was thinking of Host, the 2020 movie, as an example. And this movie is basically a recording of a Zoom call. And as an audience, as you watch this movie, you're sitting there in your room watching the screen as if you were actually watching a Zoom call, like you're seeing the same thing that you would see in real life, so to speak. So this experience of the physical space, how does it contribute to having the audience immersed in a more realistic way? And again, contrasting with these found footage movies, when you are like seeing an image of people running through the woods or up and down a building stairs, as it happens in Rec, which is very different from the physical experience you're literally having as an audience member. So does this physical aspect have a role in integrating the audience in the narrative, or how is this sense of being there important in the Gothic and horror genre in terms of the workings of fear?
You pick up a really interesting sort of area of overlap, but also, where both diverge. I think that, certainly in my work, I was initially interested in the dynamics of found footage horror, precisely for the reasons that you raised. How do these films put us in the action? How do they try and break the wall of mediation? And that's kind of, I was also interested in the discussion at the time, when I was writing that book around torture porn and the ethics of that kind of watching experience. And my conclusion was that we couldn't call that kind of horror, a sadistic form of horror, since it was really playing you, the viewer, for maximum affect. So you weren't getting everything from the point of view of the torturer or the tortured. It was a mixture of both in order to create more affect. Now, found footage normally creates that kind of sense of immediacy, of affect, by putting a version of you, an avatar for you, the camera, who in some cases, as in Rec, really does become almost a proxy for the viewer, because we don't have the other person properly introduced. And Pablo in that particular film doesn't really say very much. You never really see him, so that you may best embody the position of the camera. So technically, in that respect, desktop horror is very different. You've got a static position, and the image the story happens in some cases in live over a live call, as you say, in the case of host. Now, technically, that should give us a type of horror that's more democratic, insofar as, to go with a traditional idea, your gaze should be able to go wherever you want it to go. In reality, we know that's not how cinema works. And, a film like Host obviously trains you to look in one box or the other as the narrative progresses. Other films like Unfriended, the actions of the character guide your attention. And in a film like Open Windows, for example, or Searching, there's even more media involved, beyond the desktop. And in the case of Searching, I believe it doesn't even happen live, right? That's just a collection that's been manipulated, again, as with found footage horror. So I think that for me is where they differ. They both are interested in the being there. I think you could create a wider argument as to why we are more interested in being put into the action. I think inevitably 9/11 has something to do with this, especially the idea that the images reached us before the information. And I think that the idea that images now are in this paradoxical position, that's the what I'll be presenting that you mentioned before at the IGA, the idea that images have now got this almost indexical value. If it's not on Facebook, it didn't happen. That we use images to chronicle our lives and tell our stories of our lives and to consume others. But at the same time, digital images are much more prone to manipulation than ever before. So especially in these times of post-truth. So I think we're both beholden to the image as something that tells us reality as it's happening, just kind of what found footage is trying to do, and their complete unreliability. And I think from that kind of tension emerges found footage in desktop horror. Desktop horror I see as a natural evolution of that attempt to create something that's of the now. And in that respect, I can't think really of a better film than Host. I mean, the genius of deciding to create, irrespective of whether you like the film or not, the genius of not just making, but releasing Host in the middle of a pandemic, where people have been relying on a process, on a platform like Zoom. So, I can't help but think that that's one of the things that excite me about horror, how it always has its pulse on the now. And desktop horror does that. It just uses the media to tell a story about the media itself, really. The medium, I should say.
So to expand a little bit on this idea of space and place from what you mentioned of being there, of witnessing whatever is happening at the moment, and this idea of witnessing, how it becomes quite particular when thinking about the online realm, let's say. So moving more into the Gothic tropes, I was thinking that we could argue that the Gothic mansion as a liminal space could be translated into the immaterial existence of the internet. So the virtual space is a non-place with no physical substance. I mean, the internet is a physical thing that exists somewhere in the ocean, but we don't think about that much. But the internet as this non-place where we are not physically there. We have our certain representations or avatars or some form of displaced identity that we represent online. So do you think that this online realm can behave as a horror house in this sense? And if so, how do you think our dependency on technology contributes to these narratives? And does this new immaterial horror house want to entrap us, eat us, or does this metaphor feel insufficient or inadequate here?
Very good question. I think, so thinking back to what the house represents normally, the house is sort of like a place of safety, a place of privacy, a place of reflection normally. And that's why it's a place for Gothic hauntings to happen. They're the closest place we can find to an externalization of psychology, of our psychologies, I guess. So at a time when the private is being eroded as strongly as it is due to surveillance capitalism and the infiltration of social media into virtually everything that we do, it makes perfect sense that that analogy of the haunted house would be applied to the haunted internet. And I think you can see texts like, I don't know, peripheral or sequence break, which you suggested, so thank you for mentioning those to me in the conversation we had before this interview, where really the dynamic between the haunting of the mind and the haunting of the place sort of get melded together. And there are always these Cronenbergian sort of nightmares, aren't they, where we sort of become part of the machine, or the machine melds into us. So yeah, in other words, the trope of the haunted house gets translated into the haunted nether space of the internet, which of course is not a new concept. It's been explored in Neuromancer and the dependency. We're never just completely there in the internet, right? Our minds might be, but we're still beholden to the technology. We're still grounded in the space that unites us to the computer. So it makes perfect sense then that various things are haunted here. The internet itself, which has been full of techno ghosts, virtually since the moment it started, but also that the medium itself becomes haunted as well. So not just the internet generally, but our experience of using the internet then passes that haunting on to us, and we become a part of the haunting. I can't help but think of that earlier film. What was it called? It's escaping me now. Fear.com. The do you want to see a ghost? And it's and then you click and then you start the haunting effectively. So yeah, I would say the two are connected, because the internet has become the new home for our private thoughts and that process of reflection. So it just makes sense that we are now haunted through the very medium through which we have become dispossessed of that privacy.
So if we characterize the computer as this sort of a specter and the internet as this horror house. You were mentioning also how we become kind of part of it, and this brings to mind fictions of the automata, and especially artificial intelligence nowadays, and how they might have a similar role to the monster in Gothic fiction, and sometimes in a way that it's enticing, it's attracting to us. And especially in terms of sexuality of the autonoma that has been present for decades in fiction, mostly through men who create these gynoids a la Pygmalion and Galatea, such as Ex Machina, as a recent-ish example. So thinking about affect, which you've mentioned before in our conversation, how does the machine as a monster damage or enhance this human capacity for affect? Is the source of horror here a reflection of our fear to establish real connections with other humans? And is there a Gothic element to this, so to speak, ill-advised connection formed with the monster of the object or the liminal?
So yeah, quite a lot to unpack there as well. I think a lot of the creation of the fear of the machine that one has created has obviously a very significant point of origin in the Frankenstein story and the mad scientist tradition that comes from it. The idea of the tabula rasa in the form of Frankenstein, and whether that's perverted by nature or nurture, so to speak. But this seems to show sort of that the creation is always, to a certain extent, the product of the mind that made it, and that sort of resonates with theorizations, Marshall McLuhan, for example, of technology. as, you know, as an extension of human consciousness. Now, where I think this debate get interesting, you know, on the one hand, we've got the idea of fear of the machine, and that's not going to go away because, you know, we're constantly concerned that the power to think, to compute that machines currently have is so overwhelming and so outdoes, you know, the human brain, that perhaps is a natural concern, and we are very literally being replaced by machines in some sectors. Most scarily, perhaps soon, you know, the cars industry, you know, with automatic cars and so on. With all sorts of added considerations, like who's to blame if, you know, an automatic car has an accident, for example. So, but that fear of the machine is not going to go away. It's exponential. It's there already in the 80s as well. I'm thinking of a film like Short Circuit, which is not a horror film, but, you know, the robot takes a second to read an entire book. It takes you weeks or months to read the book. So we're outpaced by the machine. That's one thing. But you also raise the issue of the gendered nature of these productions, and that also I find quite interesting, because Ex Machina, for example, again, the robot is given a female form, and I think one of the things that this suggests, and it's been explored in texts like Frankenstein, for example, by Jeanette Winterson, is that we are creating technology at such a breakneck speed that we almost, you know, can't cope with the speed of the change. And it's quite surprising to think that, you know, the first smartphones, they're really not that far into the recent past. But our ideologies are not, or our thinking is not necessarily progressing as fast. And so what we can see in the very prosaic example of sex robots strikes me as a great example of a human creation of an object that is still tied up in quite misogynistic, quite objectifying notions of gender. So there's an example of, yes, we can now have robots that can interact with you whilst you have sex with them, but the ideology that makes those robots is not necessarily a progressive one. So the technology has outpaced, you know, our capacity to engage with the morals and the ethics of it. And that leads me to something else that is raised in Frankenstein, which is what do we do morally with this technology? At which point do we have to create rights for the AI? Because yes, it's very well for us to fear the machine, and you know, as I said, there are probably very good reasons for that. But I also worry about the other side. At which point are we going to create conscious automated life that needs some form of protection? At which point do we have rights for sex robots, for example? It might sound like a facetious question and a pointless one, but at which point will the life that we create be so autonomous, for example, that it requires? Yeah, I keep seeing is the robot, that intelligent robot that keeps appearing on media, is that Sophia? Is that her name?
Yes.
I mean, at one point is Sophia going to need to be protected legally? It's a silly question, but one that's worth beginning to pose now. We're not, in other words, the only you know, the only thing that's at risk from technology.
So thinking about these ideas of risks of technology, and kind of bringing together many of the ideas that we've been discussing, such as the audience point of view and involvement, and the different elements of the Gothic that are present in cyber terror, and our relationship to the machine and the machine's rights. I think there's been also an increase in non-fictional productions in the last year that deal with these fears and these issues that we've been talking about, say privacy, security, surveillance, all these ideas. And these sometimes are brought up by mixing documentary style with fictionalized recreations of our online existence. And I'm thinking here of the popular Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma, which foregrounded the dangers of social media and privacy by focusing on what it's, to my mind, a very crude dramatization of the supposedly dangerous experiences, instead of talking about tangible political, economic measures that could be taken or should probably be taken. And this is quite a different example, but it relates to some ideas that you were mentioning before, with the relationship to the genre of snuff movies, the documentary Don't Fuck with Cats, that explores issues that have already been discussed with this genre, but also adds the preoccupation of the exponential growth that and accessibility that goes hand in hand with the internet. So do you see horror elements in these narratives as a form of warning, of working through our fears and anxiety, both from the part of the creators and as audiences when we watch this? And are these retellings of the horrors of the digital? And as you mentioned in the beginning, there's this issue of privacy and ownership and corporate ownership. So in this sense, what's the political role of horror here?
Very good questions there. I mean, to answer the first one, yes. I mean, both The Social Dilemma and Don't Fuck with Cats essentially play like horror films, don't they? They sort of like really show the effects of desktop horror, I think. And I don't know if it's a direct case of influence or maybe equivalence. I think that both examples or manifestations of clearly something that's in the air, which is the fact that we are aware that that we're being watched, that the things that we do leave a digital blueprint. There are two aspects to a documentary like Don't Fuck with Cats that interest me, because I think on the one hand, on the superficial level, obviously Don't Fuck with Cats is about the dangers of the internet, the direct dangers of the internet as a place that doesn't necessarily regulate harmful content, right? So, the case of Luca Magnotta, someone who uploaded first videos of cats that he was killing for views, and then eventually the murder of a real person. So yeah, in that respect, the documentary does raise some very good questions about how do we regulate and stop that kind of content from existing. A film like Unfriended Dark Web that explores the dark web goes even deeper into that dark hole of unregulated content that is not even indexed, by search engines. But there is another dark side to that documentary, which scares me just as much, which is the zealousness of the people who looked for Luca Magnotta and how easy it was for them to track him down, it was a long process, admittedly, but they were faster than the police. They were able to use the digital medium against him. They were able to use his digital blueprint against him, and that scares me just as much, that it is possible to do that in today, that you can just follow someone's digital tracks to the point where you can identify them, where they are, and what they've done, everything they've posted. So to me, it's a great documentary because it both plays like a horror film and it raises all these issues around surveillance capitalism. What else did I want to mention? I guess this might sound a bit controversial, but I think to go to the idea of what role does the Gothic have to play here, I'm not sure that the Gothic is doing things to remove anymore, because it doesn't have to. I feel like Gothic and horror films are playing almost like social realism now. I watch a film, okay, so something like Host that involves the supernatural, maybe not so much, but horror films that don't invoke supernatural, they could be documentaries too. I was watching Ratter and thinking, okay, this is far-fetched, but not that far-fetched. We probably are being recorded constantly, whether knowingly or not, or at least the capacity is there for people to hack into our work, into our laptops, into our gadgets, and to record us. And even if that doesn't happen, we know for a fact that everything we do online is being tracked by big tech like Facebook, like Google. Everything you like, everything you click through is leaving a record somewhere, and that terrifies me. That to me is the real horror story behind all of this, and we need laws to stop this. I think it has a direct impact, not just on our privacy and the erasure between the private and the public. I think it has a deeper effect, as we have seen in the States, with the possibility of democracy being eroded even more than it has so far. So it's interesting that technology that was sold to us as something that would enable all the freedom, the freedom of information, has actually been in quite a dark and yeah, rather icky way being turned into a new panopticon.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. That's true. I agree. That's the true horror behind this thing that we put so much hope on for being a democratizing tool and then becoming in a new panopticon. That's very true. So finally, before opening up our discussion to our public, could you share some final thoughts on the role of cyber horror in this, maybe in how is it gonna develop in the future, and how is it gonna continue to play with our contemporary cultural anxieties?
It's hard to say, because I think in many respects, some of the things that I would have naturally suggested would be the future of, digital horror have already happened. So, I think we're just going to see an increased interest in, policing. I think Catherine Zimmer, in her brilliant book on surveillance cinema, talks about surveillance as the logic of contemporary cinema. It's a complex argument that I probably don't have time to cover. It has to do with the dynamics of cinema itself. But I do think that sort of blurring between the private and the public is going to continue to be an area of concern. I don't think it's a surprise that all these texts are about the supernatural ones are about the media taking on a life of its own that you can't control. Thinking of something like friend request, where the internet gathers its own life through a witch and starts posting the things you don't want posted, or films where the technology overtakes and does things you wouldn't want them to do. I think that those are all of them strike me as examples of that kind of sense of dispossession that the media that that should be there to help us can actually be used against us. So I'd say that's one thing. I definitely think we're going to see more videos about isolation, not just because of COVID, but because of the natural. I mean, Cairo was a great, from 2001, Pulse was a great film in terms of anticipating a lot of this. And I think we still haven't seen everything that horror can do with that idea of the internet as a tool for isolation, and how social media in particular encourage a particular type of very superficial level of engagement. So I think it's inevitable that we're going to see maybe stories about the ills of isolation in the media, but also maybe stories that begin to fantasize about isolation a bit more, where isolation becomes a route into privacy, into escaping the noise of the hyperactivated world. And finally, for the reasons that I mentioned before, I think it's inevitable that we're going to see more horror stories focusing on forms of totalitarian control. So I think it's inevitable that we're going to see more dystopias, and that the technology is going to play a significant part of that. So I think currently the greatest fear for a lot of this, stuff, social media and so on, is that these tools that are used to collect our behavioral surplus are eventually transformed into future markets. Where the real market is in predicting behavior, because if you can predict behavior, there's no room for uncertainty, and there's more certainty for markets and for selling particular products. If you know what someone likes, if you can work out a profile of who they are from their daily interactions, you can work out what they need when they need it. In fact, you can work it out before they even need it. So I suspect those are the type of nightmares that we're likely to encounter over the next 20 years, which will build up on the concerns explored by found footage and desktop horror.
Well, thank you very much. That's all very interesting, and I'm sure that our public has some questions to ask you. So I'm gonna open the floor. Sure. You can raise your hand, and I'll call your name. So we have a question from Anna.
Hello again. So this just came to my mind now when you were talking about the non-fictional kind of digital documentary on this showing and fueling this fear of the digital world and stuff. So, when I want to watch something binge at night and I don't have the attention, I usually watch either food shows or true crime. Oh. So I was watching recently, I just watched this crime scene at the Cecil Hotel where it's the story of this girl that disappeared and they found her dead in the water tank of the hotel. And aside from the story, I found very interesting that a part of the documentary series was focused precisely either on the found footage, basically, because they found footage from an elevator and you could see her, and this sparked the attention of the public, and they really insist on this footage mystery. And then there was the other interesting part was precisely what you were talking about now. So the tracking of people on the internet, because these internet detectives, wannabe detectives, tracked down this dude that was in Mexico at the time. So he couldn't have possibly been involved. And they accused him for some reason to be the murderer. And this guy had his life shattered. I mean, he lost everything. And I liked that at the end of the documentary, they interviewed him. And actually, they underlined this issue, even if I think not enough. So do you think that, I was just wondering, do you think that this new or renewed passion for the true crime shows, do you think there's been a sort of blending with some horror techniques, with some, I don't know, with techniques and narrative strategies that are usually found in horror narratives?
Yeah, sounds really. I must confess I haven't seen this particular documentary, but I'll track it down. It sounds to me, very very likely that somewhere there must be a recording of something that incriminates someone. That just by dint of the amount of surveillance footage that exists. I don't know whether in this particular case, or was it the investigators that were using this, or was it a public effort or a private effort?
The police released this footage from the elevator, and for some odd reasons later on, these internet people, they just thought that this other guy was the murderer. It was just, you watch it and you're like, really? I mean, this guy wasn't even there. So I really felt watching this series that there was really, it seemed, it was like a horror series, a fictional horror series. It was just planned and narrated like a horror series, not like a true crime, just a documentary. And I thought it was very interesting.
Yeah, they definitely speak to each other. I mean, the surveillance ethic is the same. I guess in this particular case, it's being put to good service technically in order to uncover a crime, but the incrimination of someone who didn't have anything to do with it, and then of course I mean, I don't know if this is particularly the case with that you're mentioning, but I suspect his life was shattered because of the immediacy of the whole thing, and that he couldn't speak back to it. I think that's the other thing that's scary about the cyber life today. Is just once you enter the fray, so to speak, it's quite difficult to recover from it because it's just so relentless. Especially I'm thinking of Twitter, where most battles are being fought these days. So yeah, I suspect that it's one feeding of the other. And the documentary is definitely learning a lot from the surveillance logic of some of horror cinema.
Perfect, thank you.
Thank you.
You can avoid watching it. It's not that good. But I thought it was very interesting because it exactly used those things, and it was built like a horror movie. Really, it was really building on the suspense of these two things, and in the end, the mystery wasn't really mystery. I mean, so it was interesting. Thank you.
I find the idea of documentaries being turned into sort of like larger mystery series quite an interesting thing. I mean, it's probably not new. Things always have a longer history than you think, but I've definitely noticed that, the idea that we now turn documentaries into sort of suspense stories.
Yeah, they're kind of building some suspense on nothing. Sometimes really there's nothing to build suspense on, but it's just, I don't know, it seems like everything you watch has to to stimulate you with some mystery, some
Yeah.
underlying
But you watched
mystery.
till the end, didn't you?
I did, and I binged on it.
There you go. So that's the job done.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So next question is by Zhang.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you. So I'm interested in kind of the idea of how, like, when the horror occurs, what makes us scared is the idea of how, you know, like, kind of non-human objects and kind of automatas kind of start to be acting and kind of have consciousness. So my question is how the agency of humans and kind of automatas in cyberpunk fiction and films portrayed in these media, is it something described as like, you know, something that humans and the automata already have, intrinsically have, or is it something that they develop throughout the course of the films or the fiction?
Do you mean their humanity or their uncanny sort of nature?
Both, yeah, the uncanny and their human kind of features.
I think there is sort of like a tipping point, isn't there? The point at which it sort of starts, and obviously it's text dependent. They don't all do the same. But I'm thinking, to go back to the example that Laura was, referring to, Ex Machina. That strikes me as a great example of a story that, you know, where it's okay so long as the automata is the one that's being, I would say colonized, you know, the one that's under control. Of course, the key of that story is the fact that the automata has been outsmarting the human the whole way through and playing on human emotion. I think that is the perhaps the most uncanny aspect of automatas, not just the fact that they sort of like walk that path between what we recognize in human and inhuman, you know, where the machine sort of like takes over, but the fact that we never really know what they're thinking or who has programmed and for what. You know, I think that whenever I've seen those Sophia videos, the first thing, one of the things that the robot says is, you know, you shouldn't fear me, or you know, I'm not trying. And then of course, what you see in the comments, they were saying, I do not trust her. She's obviously going to overtake. And so I think there's something there around control and around who gets to make decisions that's quite intrinsic. I mean, I would say it's almost natural for us to feel that, because we simply don't know what hides behind the programming of those particular robots. It's the same way that we don't know who's hiding behind Alexa or Siri, right? You know, we talk to this mechanized voice that's been, you know, programmed for our benefit to seem amicable, but where does that information go, and who uses it? I think it's that you can extrapolate that to the idea of the automaton. You know, at that point at which you lose control over, you know, not just the situation, but what the robot does with you.
And do you think that this kind of discourages us to kind of spending more time with technologies in a way, because it makes us scared and think about kind of the control and, you know, the power that technology might have upon us?
I think it's the exponential aspect, the AI, you know, the exponential nature of AI thinking, that at some point it learns from itself and from, you know, and that can outsmart our capacity to do that. I think that's what creates the ultimate. As with all things human, I think it's just a question of mastery, and the moment that we feel that we are outmastered, that's the moment where we freak out. How I personally feel about them, I don't know. I guess, as I was trying to get across, I don't think my concern is not with the automaton itself, but the fact that I feel the automaton is a voice for something else that I'm not seeing. I would like to know who is behind the automaton and who is doing the programming and what's happening to the information that goes behind it. That's my real concern. The other stuff seems to me still, although maybe not for much longer, sort of dystopian and futuristic.
Yeah. Thank you.
I hope that makes sense.
No, definitely. That's very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we go on to Caitlin.
Hi, thank you for this presentation. This was really helpful for me because I've been thinking a lot about surveillance capitalism, but in haunted house films. And thank you also for recommending the Catherine Zimmer book. It looks perfect. I just looked it up. So my question is about Well, I sort of want you to talk a little about how you see bodies and maybe even body horror play into desktop horror, because as you were talking, I was thinking a bit about how surveillance capitalism sort of takes our digital selves and transforms us down into just data. And I was thinking too about how the internet could be, and you talked about this, it could have been this place of freedom, or at least that's how we were originally imagining it, in this idealistic utopian sense. But then there's this also this loss of freedom in the way that we're broken down into data. And I think this comes across too in some horror movies, like well, even the work we do to create our digital self. So I was thinking in Don't Fuck with Cats, we even see that with Luca Magnotta, all the work he did to create this identity. We see it in Unfriended a little bit too. And also in non-horror films, like the recent Jumanji remake, there was sort of a chance for body horror there. So yeah, I was thinking about this, and also the return of our past selves too, because this other identity we sort of have to grapple with. And I think that can be a sort of body horror in a way as well.
I think there are two types of body horror that are connected to digital horror. One of them has to do with the addiction, to digital media, and it's a very real horror insofar as studies have been made where, and I think in The Social Dilemma this is actually portrayed, unless I'm misremembering, where they actually take the phone away from the kid and he's just so physically bound to that phone, so dependent on it, that he cannot go 24 hours without it. That this seems like an overreaction. It's actually based on real studies that have proven the same, that people who have been dispossessed of their phones or tablets for longer than 24 hours start going a little bit mad. Start showing all the withdrawal syndromes that people who are addicted to substances show. So that kind of dependency, I think, translates into some films in the melding of the whatever system is being used with the person. I think I mentioned Sequence Break and Peripheral as two stories that do that really well. Whether it is a console that the gamer is playing that whether they start fusing with their own flesh, or Sequence Break is the one with computing the video game, and Peripheral is the one with the writer that starts sort of like getting inked up and becoming part of the system. So I think those types of body horrors explore the dependency on social media and how we become, we become so dependent on that digital version of ourselves, the constant checking for updates, that we lose ourselves in the process. The other one, I think that the one that you mentioned in Unfriended and stuff, is just the capacity of social media to dictate lives now. Because obviously one of the things that we're given the illusion that because we have a Facebook profile that's ours, or an Instagram profile that's ours, that we have all the freedom in the world to project to the world who we are. But of course, that's not the case. We succumb to peer pressure in the same way that we do socially. And I think what worries me, and what maybe some of these stories are beginning to do, is filter that through, how we never really are who we think we are online. We are the person that pleases the most of our followers, and there is something of our personality lost in there, inevitably. And whether indeed we can talk of ourselves in avatars, in profiles, is another question. Films like Unfriended also seem to be exploring another aspect of this, which is, in one way or another, what you might call revenge porn, or the sharing of our images. Again, the erosion of the private and the person and the public, stuff that's ours that we don't want others to see, that gets revealed. And Unfriended, that's the cause of the haunting. A woman who is humiliated publicly on their Facebook, and there's no going back from that. It's the same in Friend Request, someone who's humiliated and they come back. So it strikes me like those are the three things that body horror does, explore the addiction, explore the fake construction of ourselves and social pressure, and the impact of other people sharing data that should be ours in private.
Thank you.
Thank you. And good luck with your research.
Thanks.
So we have a final question from Heather.
Hi. Well, first of all, thank you. I found this really interesting. My question is about what you were talking about with the sort of digital desktop horror. And with the current rise in like Zoom and Teams and this sort of work from home in a current COVID era and looking towards the post-COVID era, would you say this has sort of globalized, and at least in the Western world, sort of understanding of desktop horror, or is there still something that you would classify about the genre as being sort of quintessentially American? Or is it this just because of like the prevalence of American-based companies like the big data, Facebook and Twitter?
Well, it's interesting. Very, very good question. I would say a bit of both, because of course, Zoom has strong links to China, if I'm not mistaken. And also, what's the other? TikTok, of course, has links to China as well. But yes, all the big tech is in Silicon Valley and other parts of the States. So yes, I would say that it has global reach, but it has, at the level of who owns this data is still pretty much, at the heart of it, American. I would say though that with Google and Microsoft and Facebook all having, a presence globally, not just in the States, it becomes a significant problem. I think where we still might see a difference is in the fact that certainly in Europe, for example, we now have GDPR rules, and I really, really hope that's the beginning of a turn towards a harsher take on the regulation of personal data. It doesn't go anywhere near far enough, but I hope that GDPR and things like it might change the way that other countries where this is not as strongly regulated, like the US or China. China will be a harder nut to crack because of their own political system and so on. But yeah, I think obviously the pandemic has changed things a lot. I'm not a huge fan of Zoom purely because I don't like its ties. But I would say that irrespective of where it was made, Zoom was a film that was able to appeal to all of us because it wasn't necessarily about the technology exclusively. It was also about communication and sort of contact during the pandemic. And I think that is probably what takes it further into a text that's not just American or or nationally specific. It's clearly a text about connecting with people at the time of isolation. So you could say it's a text about media squared, insofar as if you believe the idea that media ultimately isolates you more than it connects you, then it's a film about the pandemic, but it's also a film about how media that's supposed to connect us actually just further isolates us. Don't know if that answers your question. I've gone in quite a few turns.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
So if we don't have any more questions, I think we don't. I'm gonna ask everyone to turn on their cameras so we can give a final thank you to Xavier for being here with us today. It's been a pleasure to have you here with us, and the conversation has definitely been very, very interesting. And yeah, thanks.
Thank you for inviting me. It's my pleasure.
Thank you.
And good luck with the rest of the conference, by the way. I hope to be able to make a few of the sessions.
Thank you.